Hello, folks, and welcome to Season 2 of Author Adjacent, a podcast about the journey from hobbyist writer to professional author. I'm your host, Michael Vadney. If you're listening to this, you might hesitate to call yourself an author. Even I'm not there yet, but I am author adjacent. I started this podcast as a fellow journeyman on the path from writer to author in the hopes that what I learn along the way will help you fulfill your own writing dreams. But first, a word from our partner. That's right, Author Adjacent is still partnered with Moonlit Getaway, a multi-genre online literary journal set to begin publication on September 23rd, 2024. Their grand opening contest is currently accepting submissions in the categories of visual art, flash fiction, and poetry. The contest is free to enter, and the deadline for submission is August 1st of this year. That's less than a month away, so hurry over to moonlitgetaway.com for details. I'll have a link in the description for anyone who is interested. Now back to the episode. In today's episode, we will become almighty gods as I tell you about one of the most essential elements of storytelling, world building. Whether you're crafting a fantastical realm filled with dragons and magic, a dystopian future where society has crumbled, or a two-bedroom apartment that Oliver has moved into after university, world building is the process of creating the fictional world within your novel. While world building is most commonly associated with fantasy and science fiction novels, every fictional story requires some world building. Take Oliver, for example. He is the protagonist of a small-town, Hallmark-inspired romance that I made up for this episode. Oliver lives in a small town in England called Frankshire. He moved there after graduating university to open a coffee shop. While England is a real place, you would still be world-building the made-up town of Frankshire and Oliver's coffee shop. Oliver will be popping in and out of this episode as I give more small-scale examples to balance out the galaxy-spanning epics. But world building is more than just creating the setting of your novel. It's the cultures, the religions, the politics, the food. It's simply the world. And sometimes the world of your story is a single room. For this episode, I'll go over some world building basics before laying out a list of tips to keep in mind the next time you need to summon a story world into existence. Time for the basics. We can roughly categorize world building into two options. Option 1, real world, where your setting is the world we live in as human beings, on Earth, like Oliver. Say hi, Oliver. Hello? In this option, you can rely heavily on your reader's understanding of the real world. Though, if you set the story too far into the past, you may have to explain things to them, like what's a rotary phone? Good examples of this kind of world building is Deception Point by Dan Brown and any Jack Ryan book by Tom Clancy. Option number 2 is second world. This is the option for when your story does not take place on Earth. It's set in a new land with its own history, geography, and inhabitants that are separate from ours. This is where most sci-fi and fantasy epics live. So think of the stories like Lord of the Rings and Dune. But this also covers worlds like those depicted in Zootopia. There is also a third option which mixes these two types of world building into a single story, where the setting is our real world, but with fantastical corners that the reader can explore. Harry Potter takes this option to world building. The whole series takes place in the real-world England between the years of 1991 and 1998, but the hidden wizarding world is entirely second-world fantasy. There are many examples of blending these two types of world building, from the Chronicles of Narnia to Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. This would be like if Oliver's coffee shop was also a haven for werewolves who lived around the small town of Frankshire, England. Something to keep in mind when deciding between these two options is the amount of work you want your story to do to explain the world to the reader. In general, a real-world structure will require less explanation than a second world. This may sound obvious, but it's because your reader lives in the real world, so they know what a cell phone is and how traffic works. So you don't need to explain to them how Oliver was late to open his coffee shop due to the disorganized herd of cars he had to get through to get to work. With our definitions out of the way, I want to introduce you to 4 tips for developing your novel's world that I and many others have used to create wondrous worlds for our stories. Before we get into these tips, a quick disclaimer. like with many things in writing, there is no one correct way to build your world. This is not a step-by-step plan, though I'll try to start with the tips that I think should be done earlier in the process. Instead, I have a toolbox of methods that you can pick and choose from. Try them out and see which works best for you. I'll be bringing examples from my own writing along the way, and hell, why not? I'll drag Oliver along too. No, please don't! Ah! Tip number 1. Determine how much world building is needed. I'm starting with this tip because there is a prevalent propensity for writers to overindulge in the world building process, especially for fantasy and sci-fi writers. And I get it. It feels like being a god when you can determine the geography of a continent or the political structure of Frankshire, England. You can shape the world as you see fit, and it's fun to do so. But it's not writing, and it's important to remember that as you exercise this foundational step of your novel. So I implore you to get through the world-building process as fast as possible and get to the real work of your novel, which is writing the story that people will actually read. This is a danger for both pantsers and plotters. For plotters, it's the area of the storytelling that lends itself strongly to outlining and mapping, which makes it easy to fall into the inevitable spiral of planning hell, while pantsers can get caught up in the false productivity of world building. Those are, of course, generalities. My point is that over world building is a danger to everyone. So, how much world building should you do? That is a great question, Oliver. I knew it was a good idea to bring you along. There are a few different ways to determine how much world building you should do, but ultimately they all conclude to as much as you need to write the story. No more, no less. If your novel is a multi-continental adventure, like Indiana Jones, then you will likely require more world building than Oliver's small-town residence of Frankshire. You can determine how much your story requires by knowing which parts of the world will affect your story and its characters. There is no point in developing a part of the world that will never appear or affect what the reader will experience. In the case of Oliver, I wouldn't start developing the political structure of a hidden desert city in Australia because the story is about Oliver finding love in his Frankshire coffee shop and not about discovering treasure in an ancient tomb. But what if I'd rather be a treasure hunter? Not now, Oliver. The golden question here is, how does this aspect of the world matter to the story I'm telling? If the answer is, it doesn't, then don't waste your precious time developing it. So start writing as soon as you are able and understand that you may have to come back to the world building later if your story goes off in a direction you had not planned for. And that's okay. Tip number 2, take shortcuts. World building does not need to explode into existence out of a vacuum of nothing. You can instead rely on the trends in your genre and real-world examples of places and cultures. First, let's look at your story's chosen genre. For many stories, the genre it can be categorized in will make many decisions for you in the realm of world building. If you are writing a cyberpunk neo-noir mystery, then genre conventions dictate that your story will likely take place in a major city with technology beyond that what we have today in the real world. But keep in mind that knowing the conventions of your genre doesn't mean you have to follow them. This is a little bit of a tangent, but you could also determine that you instead want this cyberpunk story to take place on a futuristic farm, where the mystery is the solving of a murder of a farmhand in this ultra-modern mix of country living and advanced farming technology. In either case, understanding your story's genre will give you a starting point for your world building that will directly affect the setting and characters. Another great shortcut to take is to base your world building off of real-world events and places. I've mentioned this before in other episodes, but all it takes is a 20% change to an idea to make it feel fresh and new. A Song of Ice and Fire series by George R.R. Martin is a masterclass example of this. The main overarching conflict within the series is strongly influenced by the very real War of the Roses, which was a war fought for the English throne between the years of 1455 and 1487. Even the names of the primary families that fought in that war, Lancaster and York, went on to inspire houses Lannister and Stark. House Tyrell and the city of Highgarden were inspired by the high courts of medieval France, while the Dothraki, a culture of nomadic horse-mounted warriors, was based on the Mongolian Empire. I used this technique in my own project as well. The island nation of Burunt, which is where the story takes place, is strongly influenced by the real-world nation of Malta, an island country in the Mediterranean Sea. I heavily endorse this method as a way to save time in your world building. If it's good enough for the likes of George R.R. Martin and Robert Jordan and thousands of other authors, it's good enough for you. Tip number 3, ground the world in reality. The more fantastical your world is, the more important it is to give the reader something to hold on to that will ground them into the story. A major part of a story's enjoyment is determined by the reader's ability to suspend their belief and be part of the world you have created. And that becomes incredibly difficult if your story takes place in a world that is outlandishly different from our own. This tip is more for second world novels, as stories like Oliver and the Coffee Shop are grounded by default due to their setting being in the world that we live in. But for stories that take place in a place vastly different than our own, we need to give the reader a familiar place to start and venture into the new imagined landscape that we have created. One strong way to do this is through relatable characters. No matter where your story takes place, people are still people, with the same basic motivations of survival, happiness, and acceptance. If the reader can connect with your point of view characters, then they will be able to borrow the character's understanding of the world they exist in. When the character reacts normally to a giant owl talking on the street corner, then the reader can surmise that this is normal in the story's world, or at least to that character. A great example of this is Mushroom Blues by Adrian M. Gibson. It's a fungal punk noir that takes place in a world heavily influenced by mushrooms, with people, animals, and the very world being made up of mushrooms. The world is bizarre and alien in many ways, but is made approachable to the reader by experiencing this strange new place through the book's main character, Henrietta Hoffman, a human homicide detective. The reader learns about the world of Mushroom Blues as Hoffman does, and is signaled by Hoffman when something is normal and when something is not. This gives the reader an anchor from which to learn about the setting and the cultures of the story. Another way to ground your fantastical world is to be consistent. Once you have established a rule with the reader, make sure you don't break that rule without a good explanation and a clear reason. Otherwise, you risk being called out for plot holes. As you build your world, reinforce the rules you create through how it functions. While these rules may not be the focus of your story, they should be prominent and accepted as normal throughout. In Harry Potter, it's established that witches and wizards can fly while utilizing special brooms. It would be jarring for the reader if there was suddenly a witch who flew around on a vacuum. As I mentioned before, make sure to prioritize the story over the world. As fascinating and engaging as the Harry Potter world can be, the real immersion of the story comes from what happens, not where it happens. My last suggestion for grounding the world in reality is to establish a logical history. In many cases, the conflict of a novel is the result of past events that led to the story's beginning. The world of the Hunger Games was a result of natural disasters and war, while Lord of the Rings stemmed from the decision of one man not destroying a ring. It's important to note that you don't need a lot of details on the history, just enough to understand and explain to the reader how the world got to the point where your story begins. Tip number 4, carefully reveal the world building. Alright, you've built your world, you created just enough of it to start writing, and have a bullet point list of the history that led to this moment. Now it's time to efficiently inform the reader of all the cool stuff you built for your world. But how do you do that without info dumping all over the first 10 pages? Carefully, through character and plot. That's how. Introduce world-building elements bit by bit rather than all at once. This helps maintain a steady flow of information and keeps the readers engaged without overwhelming them with names, places, and events that are not immediately relevant. You can then tie the world-building directly into your plot. If your world has a unique political system, make it a source of conflict for your protagonist. Perhaps they are fighting against an unjust regime or trying to navigate a complex bureaucracy to achieve their goals. The intricacies of the political system will naturally come to light as the protagonist interacts with that system. You can avoid info dumping the details of this political system by revealing those details at the moment they become relevant to the characters and their actions. As mentioned in tip number 4, a character's perspective is a great vehicle for filtering the world-building details through their experiences and viewpoints to the reader. What the character notices, thinks about, or discusses will organically provide information to the reader. Characters can reveal world-building through natural conversation. This has the added benefit of making dialogue feel authentic, while avoiding exposition dumps. If you have no other way of getting important world information to the reader at the time they need it, you can always try utilizing a flashback or a memory jump. But I would caution to use these sparingly, as they are a clunky tool that can easily be used improperly. If you want a great example of how to do flashbacks well, check out The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wong. She somehow makes heavy use of memory jumps in a way that keeps the narrative flowing smoothly every time. I know I've been harping on this next point, but remember to only include world-building details that are directly relevant to the story at the moment. Unnecessary information can be saved for later or omitted entirely. I keep talking about this because I know how easy it is to start overloading the reader, especially in a fantasy or sci-fi setting. Alright folks, that is going to wrap it up for this episode of Author Adjacent. Thanks for hanging out with me today as I presented some tips on how to do world building right. Say goodbye, Oliver. Time for you to fall in love in a coffee shop. No, I'm going to go be a tomb raider. What? No, wait, where are you going? Come back! Ah, crap, he's gone. Well, anyways, once again, I'm your host, Michael Vadney. If any of this was helpful or even just gave you a good chuckle, consider supporting the show by leaving a review on your podcast platform of choice or telling a friend about the show. And I'd like to thank my dear friend Hamster for putting together the music for this episode. If you liked it too, feel free to reach out to him at hamster90@hotmail.com. Maybe you can work something out with him. That's HAMSTIR90@hotmail.com. For more Author Adjacent, you can follow me on X @AuthorAdjacent or shoot me an email at authoradjacent@gmail.com with your burning questions, comments, or topic ideas. New episodes drop every other week, so stay tuned. Now remember, the journey from writer to author might be long, but until then, let's be author adjacent together.